I'm sure at this point, a majority of you have seen the show Mr. Rogers. If you have not, the fact that you exist eludes me very greatly. But don't worry, it's not that hard to explain. It was an educational show that aired from 1968 to 2001, basically just to teach kids how to function as human beings. Like, he taught them incredibly basic stuff like, what does the mailman do? How are crayons made? How to tie your shoes, in a soft-spoken manner with puppets in the land of make-believe, which was a staple for many children growing up within this 40-year time period. Now, of course, you may be wondering, why am I talking about this show on this show? Well, as the clickbaity title of this video suggests, I'm going to make the claim that Fred Rogers was arguably one of the most progressive television show icons, period. Is it clickbaity? Yes. But it's also not that far from accurate. Now, if you watch the Mr. Rogers documentary, there's a good chance that you saw the title, clicked it, and then immediately went to the comments to type out this. Fred Rogers was a Republican, so he's clearly not a progressive. To which I'm going to have to give you some political truth bombs. You see, by the time that Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood just started airing, the conservative wing of the GOP kind of just started becoming powerful. By that time, the party was dominated by the liberal wing, like the Warrens and the Rockefellers, and not the conservatives like the Tafts or the Goldwaters. And with that was the beginning of the so-called party switch, where people who were lifelong Democrats started voting Republican, and people who were lifelong Republicans started voting Democrat, because the ideals of the heads of the parties flipped. And according to his wife Joanne, he was very independent in how he voted, suggesting that his political registration was nothing more than just his registration. And as we'll get into, some of the things that it seems were core tenets of his beliefs don't necessarily mesh with what the GOP would become during his show's airing. Rogers had actually tried to keep his political beliefs very unknown, as he was a children's entertainer, and he didn't want to, shove, political beliefs onto his kids. There wasn't, a Mr. Rogers episode where he gave his in-depth analysis on tax policy. But more moral political issues were his forte. In fact, one of which became a hot topic on the internet. The 5-part beginning of season 14, Conflict, where Mr. Rogers actually really heavily criticizes the Cold War. So what happens is, the episode begins really normal to begin with. Mr. Rogers is just trying to teach the kids something, but then, in the neighborhood of make-believe, King Friday becomes suspicious of a neighboring town, believing that they're ramping up their military to attack him. So he, in turn, ramps up his military to prepare a preemptive strike against them. And it's not like a sugarcoating either. King Friday name drops the word bomb and dresses up in military garb and everything. The arc ends with both sides coming together and talking out their issues, and King Friday learns that it was very silly of him to make assumptions without even talking to the other side. The reason why these episodes became a hot topic on the internet was not only because of the fact that these episodes are pretty weird to think about. Mr. Rogers made a 5-episode miniseries talking about the Cold War in a very not-so-subtle manner, but also because those were the last times those episodes aired because of the very obvious political nature of this messaging. There even became more interest because in 2017, 2 of these episodes coincidentally were released on the internet around the same time that President Trump was proposing a budget that would heavily cut PBS funding in favor of funding the military. We'll get back to that subject in a bit, but as you can tell, Mr. Rogers was not exactly a cold warrior. So much so that when the Cold War's tensions started easing, Fred flew to the USSR and made a guest appearance on their most popular children's program, Good Night Little Ones. And his anti-war attitude didn't just extend to the Cold War, He also dissented on the Vietnam and Persian Gulf Wars, even outright praising Senator John Hines for introducing a bill that made it so that soldiers who had kids would not be deployed, saying,
"We must not perpetuate abuse from one generation to the next, and separation from a young child's security is a gross form of abuse."
While we were talking about Mr. Rogers' political actions outside of the show, we can get back to the subject of PBS funding, as that was something that Fred was very passionate about. Fred understood that pre-K to elementary school years were a very important time for children to develop, and he felt that children should have access to a very vital learning tool to help them develop, especially considering he knew for a fact that there were some children who didn't have access to a lot of other learning tools, particularly low-income children in inner cities. So one of his forefront political issues was to make sure that PBS remained well-funded, even giving a passionate speech to the Senate to keep PBS well-funded. I'd include the full thing here, but this video would drag on if I did, so I'll just link it here instead. But I'll give a brief summary to explain why this one is so important. You see, the person who was in charge of the Subcommittee on Communications was Senator John Pastore, a conservative Democrat well known for cutting government spending where he found it wasteful. And as is the case, PBS became one of the first targets. He was a notorious hardhead who was basically like, I'm a no-nonsense type of guy, who really just would not budge on anything. Many heads of PBS read their written statements to him, but he basically brushed them off. The hearing was essentially a formality before he cut their budget. But as a Hail Mary, they let one of their newest showrunners, Fred Rogers, prepare a statement for the subcommittee as well. However, when it was his turn to talk, he just went off script, and instead gave a passionate dialogue to explain to Pastore why shows like his were very vital to children. Pastore tried to do what he did with the other guys and interrupt to ask questions, but Rogers wasn't having it. And this caught Pastore off guard, and he remained silent for the rest of the speech. And when Rogers was finished, Pastore simply responded with,
"I think it's wonderful. Looks like you just earned the $20 million.
Another thing Rogers was very vocal on were his social views. He was an animal rights advocate, being both a vegan and opposing animal fur being used for clothing. He also used his programming to try and influence how people viewed social norms. First, feminism. He had a lot of female characters take very important roles in his show that would provide good role models for girls who happen to watch. Lady Elaine Fairchild was an astronaut and a newscaster before women were able to do it in real life. And he had Maggie of Southwood be the show's mayor before the first African-American woman became mayor outside of the show. But I think the one that we all know the most about is the relationship between Mr. Rogers and Officer Clemens. As the name suggests, he was a police officer in the neighborhood of Make-Believe. Now, as you may notice, Officer Clemens is African American, and that fact was used for a lot of progressive things. First, having a prominent African American cast member on a kids show was notable enough, but he also had this African American character be a well-respected authority figure, trying to show you can trust people of every race. And since the way the show is formatted, this guy wasn't just some random cop that was in the show. As the lyrics of his theme song suggest, he's supposed to be everybody's neighbor, and neighbors are supposed to be friendly to each other. So this prominent African-American character was friends with this prominent white character, being one of the forefront shows of trying to break the color barrier. And one of the ways he did it was when Mr. Rogers invited Officer Clemens to soak his feet in a pool with them, and they shared a towel to dry off, as a reference to the fact that desegregated community pools were just starting to become a thing. But there is one more important aspect that might not be as well known as the obvious race one. You see, Clemens was gay, and he felt incredibly isolated from a lot of his friends and family, with the exception, of course, being Fred Rogers. And Rogers basically became a surrogate father to Clemens, giving him advice and stuff regarding his sexuality when nobody else would. And as you would expect from somebody who's a surrogate father, some of the advice was good, some of it wasn't so good. Very early on, saying Clemens, "I love you, but you can't come out right now. The show will get canned. Take off the earring just in case." However, Rogers would later change his tune after Stonewall, being a lot more supportive, allowing Clemens to invite his friends to the show's set while they were recording, and also giving Clemens relationship advice, saying that he preferred if Clemens just found a guy to settle down with, rather than just going around into gay clubs and, Now, hearing the story makes everybody go, well, that's really nice that Fred Rogers was a very valuable ally to the LGBTQ community, even in a time period where the LGBTQ community wasn't that accepted. To which I say, he was no ally to the LGBTQ community. He was in the LGBTQ community, with an openly gay friend of his telling us that Fred Rogers told him,
"Well, I must be right smack in the middle, because I have found women attractive, and I have found men attractive."
Excuse me, what? So yes, apparently, one of the most well-known children's show icons was not only progressive, but also bi. You learn something new every day. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and click that bell to be notified when a future video of mine comes out. And if you're interested in more content from me, you can go to my website, follow me on Twitter, join my Discord, check out my articles on independent political report, or consider supporting me on Patreon.